Financial advice for people with disabilities. Today, I'm joined by Dr. Jim Dahle, emergency medicine physician and founder of the legendary financial blog, The White Coat Investor, and author of the book with the same name. Good to see you, Jim.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be on this podcast with you.
I should thank you personally, as many years ago, I refinanced my own student loans after reading one of your blog posts. So access to information definitely makes a difference.
Absolutely. I agree with that.
So I want to ask you about three topics related to disabilities and finance, and depending on when people become disabled. So the first category would be the most difficult situation, people who have disabilities early in life, perhaps people who are born with a disability or develop it in their early 20s, so they don't have significant work history, would not qualify for SSDI. What can they do? The next category, people who have a chronic medical condition but are still working, but they're concerned they could become disabled at some point. What precautions can they take? And the third category, people who have a long work history but don't quite make it to the finish line and have to retire earlier with less money, perhaps planning for a longer retirement. And I want to give the disclosure that although Dr. Dahle is very knowledgeable, we're not professional financial advisors, so take this as general information. And this is also a US-based discussion. Obviously, things are different in different countries. So, Jim, can you start off with that first category? Someone who's disabled early in life, may be born with a disability. This would also apply to someone who's not disabled but has a special needs child. What would you want them to know?
Well, I think the bottom line is planning early can make a big difference. And so you don't want to ignore the financial ramifications of disabled child is usually what the situation is. It's usually your child that's disabled and you're trying to plan for them. But take the bull by the horns and make a plan for what you're going to do for them, how you're going to provide for them. And a big part of that plan might be life insurance on you, because presumably they're going to be depending on you, certainly as minors and potentially into their adult years. And so you want to make sure that you are able to provide for them. And until such a time as you're not only financially independent with respect to your expenses, but with respect to their expenses, if something happens to you, you want to keep, a life insurance policy in place. And for some people, they're just not able to become financially independent enough by the end of their career. And so they end up carrying insurance into their retirement years. And at that point, you have to start thinking about some of the permanent life insurance products like whole life insurance, rather than just what most people do, which is term life insurance until you're 55 or 60 or 65 and can become financially independent on your own. So sometimes you do have to be a little bit more creative than people that do not have a disabled child have to be in order to make sure that you can provide for that person. So I think that's step one, is just get planning, make sure you've got money there to take care of them in the event that something happens. Because if there isn't money there, you're left with essentially what the government will provide for them. And while there are some programs in place for them, they are not particularly generous. And they can be difficult to qualify for, and certainly difficult to jump through all the hoops to get the paperwork done and that sort of a thing. I'm an emergency physician and I work in the emergency department, and I'm amazed how many patients I still see that don't have any sort of health insurance. And a lot of times they're people that would qualify for health insurance under, the Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, but they just couldn't put two and two together enough to actually apply for it, even though basically they would be receiving a tax break big enough to cover their entire premium. So, having somebody that can help walk you through those government benefits available, I think is almost more valuable than the benefits themselves.
Yeah, and we won't get into the technicalities of different welfare benefits, but one thing that most people would qualify for if they have a serious disability early in life, like say cerebral palsy, for instance, is SSI and Medicaid, which is Medi-Cal, where I am in California. And, I have a patient who is a 23-year-old with cerebral palsy and is unable to work. And her father was just now thinking about applying for SSI, but they missed out on 5 years of income, which, like you said, is not a lot. It's $943 maximum in 2024, minus about a third of that if you have someone else covering your lodging and food. One thing people get into trouble with is this is a highly means tested benefit. And so if you're a single person getting SSI, you cannot have assets more than $2,000 outside of the home you may own or one car and a few other things like your personal effects, furniture, clothing, etc. But there's some ways around that, like the ABLE Act and a special needs trust, because it's really hard to live with less than $2,000 in the bank. Things happen to people. Can you talk a little bit about how to deal with that?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. The restrictions are incredible. I mean, SSI is for poor disabled people. That's what you need to think about when you think about SSI. People that don't have any money, they're not going to have much money, and they have a disability or they're 65 plus. So, I mean, I think the limit, I'm looking it up right now, is $1,913 in income per month from work. So if you're making more than that, you can't get it. If you have more than 2,000 bucks, 3,000 as a couple, you can't get it. And so it's really quite strict. And your state Medicaid limits, in your case, Medi-Cal limits, are highly variable. You know, some states are much more generous than others. My state is not that generous. Here in Utah, if you if you are an adult without children, the assumption is that you're able to work and that you won't qualify for Medicaid, and so it's very hard if you don't have children to qualify for Medicaid. It can be done, but it's hard, and you need to be familiar with your state's Medicaid regulations. And it doesn't do really good to go into, all 50 states regulations. You just need to look up your state's regulations because those are the ones that will apply to you.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you are, say, the uncle of someone with special needs or someone who's disabled young, who's collecting SSI, and you're thinking about gifting them $50,000, don't do that. What you should do instead is either give it to them in their ABLE account, which would not count against their SSI up to $100,000, or perhaps set up a special needs trust.
Yeah, this is where the planning comes in. And people do this on the other end of life too, right? If they have a grandparent or a parent that has no means and they need nursing home care, right? They spend down to Medicaid levels, or they somehow qualify for Medicaid to pay for their nursing home care. It's really no different. Some things just don't count in that calculation. And so you're able to have those assets that don't count, but you're not able to have any additional assets. The ABLE account is something that not enough people know about. The best way to think about it is that you think of it as like a 529 account, which is a college savings account, except it's not for college, it's for a disabled person. And so basically you put after-tax money in, it grows in a tax-protected way, and if it comes out and is used for their benefit, it comes out tax-free. You don't pay taxes on the earnings. It's got a similar annual contribution limit to a 529, and but it doesn't have the age 59 and a half rule you might expect in an IRA, for example. And so it's a great way, if you have some means, to put some money away for a disabled person that you care about. The rule right now is they have to be disabled before they turn 26, but that changes in 2026. Thanks to the Secure Act 2.0, that age will be increased to age 46. So this isn't for people who get disabled later in life. It's for people who get disabled early in life, but early is now, a lot more generous than it used to be.
And I believe it's also possible, if you can work a little bit and make a small income, to contribute to your own ABLE account. And
yes, absolutely. Absolutely. You can make your own contributions there. Now, the other option you mentioned was a special needs trust, right? And a trust is its own entity. It's its own legal entity. So when something is in a trust, you don't own it. And so it doesn't count toward all those Medicaid rules and all those SSI rules. But those assets can still be used to help support you. The trustee can determine, according to the rules of the trust and how it was drafted, how much, what the trust can pay for on your behalf or how much money it can give you, those sorts of things. But just like, a wealthy person can set up a spendthrift trust for their, ne'er-to-do-well child, you can set up a trust for your special needs child or your special needs niece or grandchild or whatever. And so that's another way to allow them to qualify for as much as they can from the state and or the federal government, while still having some additional assets to pay for those things that maybe those benefits and so forth would not cover.
Okay, so let's move on to the second category. Let's say someone is maybe a little bit older, 20s, 30s, 40s. They are able to work, but they have a chronic medical condition, could be lupus with chronic kidney disease, multiple sclerosis, a bad back, whatever it might be. And they know they could become more disabled and may not be able to work. What should they know?
Well, the first thing is everyone ought to realize they can become disabled, right? I mean, ask somebody that has a chronic illness, right? They didn't have it their whole life. One day they just got it. And then all of a sudden they had trouble getting insurance and that sort of a thing. So you ought to understand there's also still some government programs out there for these folks, such as SSDI, right? This is the disability benefit that comes via the Social Security Administration. And this is something you actually have to qualify for. You have to work a certain number of quarters, just like you do that Social Security retirement benefit. The rules are different for SSDI, however. You have to have worked relatively recently. I think it's within the last 3 years or so, or a certain number of quarters within the last 5 years or something like that. And then after you're a certain age, you have to have worked a certain number of quarters in order to qualify for disability benefits at all via the Social Security Administration. However, beyond that, it's really important, and very few people buy this, but it's really important to have disability insurance. You know, people become disabled all the time. If you look at the statistics, it's more than 25% of 18-year-olds will have a disability at some point before they turn 65. And that's a huge number, 1 out of 4. I mean, if 1 out of 4 houses on your street were burning down, you would certainly be buying fire insurance on your house. But for whatever reason, we don't do that for disability, and it's just ignored. So when you're young and healthy, you should go get disability insurance. Now, obviously, once you have something, and I think the example that's used on this podcast a lot would be MS. Once you have that, it becomes much more difficult to get disability insurance, at least in a fully underwritten policy. You know, the insurance company looks at that and says, wow, this person has a really high chance of becoming disabled due to their MS. And so we'll do one of two things. One, we won't sell them disability insurance at all. Or two, we're going to put a rider on their policy, an exclusion that basically says if they get disabled from MS, then we won't pay them anything. And obviously, if you've got MS and you're trying to buy disability insurance, that's not a very attractive policy, one that doesn't cover MS. And so you need to look some other places for disability insurance. For example, group policies. Your employer may offer disability insurance. And generally, they don't ask those pesky questions about your health status when you go to sign up for your insurance, especially if you buy it right as you become employed with the employer. And so that's one good method to do so. Some organizations also have access to what's called a guaranteed standard issue policy. And these are common in health centers, for instance. Doctors buy these a lot if they have a medical problem. And basically it's guaranteed. It's standard issue. So everybody can get it, whether they have, MS or some other medical condition or whether they don't. And so that's another great way to get insurance, is to check and see if some organization, whether it's a professional organization or through your employer or whatever, can provide access to a guaranteed standard issue policy. But those are all well worth looking into. Now, the other thing that's always helpful is being financially independent. If you're rich, you don't need insurance. If you can live for the rest of your life off your assets, you not only don't need insurance, but you don't need your work, at least your income from your work. And so saving more, having a higher savings rate than you might otherwise have and investing it wisely can go a long way to getting you to financial independence earlier in life than you might think possible. Lots of people become financially independent even in their 30s or 40s. And at that point, you can obviously sit back a little bit and not worry quite so much about losing the ability to earn money by working.
So in terms of savings rate, I know Dave Ramsey says 15%. You advise to doctors who are starting a little bit later, generally speaking, maybe 20%, maybe something higher than that for someone with a serious medical condition. Is that what you think?
I think that's probably wise. And but the truth is financial independence is all about your savings rate. The more you save, the sooner you're financially independent. And so some of these people that are really into this FIRE movement, which is financially independent, retire early, they might be saving 50, 60, 75% of their income just because they want to become financially independent really early in life. And it does work. The more you save, the sooner you're financially independent. So a recommendation like 15% for a typical person that starts saving in their 20s and is going to work until their 60s works fine. But that doesn't work fine if you're going to be disabled at 40. You're not going to have that much money if you've only been saving 15% for 15 years. And that might not be enough to be completely financially independent. Financial independence, of course, is it's an equation based on how much you spend, not how much you make, though. So you basically take what you spend in a year, you multiply it by 25 or so, and that's how much money you need to be financially independent. So if you spend, $50,000 a year, you can be financially independent with about 1.25 million. If you spend $100,000 a year, you'll need about $2.5 million in order to be financially independent. And that sounds like a lot of money to someone who's just getting started, saving 15% of $60,000 or $70,000 a year. That can really, seem like an awful lot of money. So it takes time. And the more you save, the sooner you get there. But nobody gets there in a year or two. This is probably a decade or two at best, even if you're saving quite a lot of your income.
Now, not everyone is a spine surgeon making $700,000 a year that can afford professional financial advice. Some people have an IRA with $5,000-$10,000 in it. They want to get started. Could you offer any portfolio advice to someone who is trying to do it themselves and is not an expert?
Yeah, probably the best thing to do. And this is a real benefit, actually, for low earners. Low earners can usually do all of their retirement savings in just one or two accounts. And those accounts are completely shielded from taxation as they grow. It might be your 401k, it might be your Roth IRA, whatever. But the truth is, you can probably put all your retirement savings in that account. And you don't have to worry about investing in a taxable brokerage account. You don't have to have the 4 or 5 different types of, investing accounts that a typical doctor ends up having. You can just have one or maybe two. And when you're doing that, you can often choose a very simple investing solution, such as a target retirement or life cycle fund. This not only provides you a very diversified investment, but it automatically adjusts and rebalances as you go through life. So it's very much a set it and forget it type of investment. And if you're buying, one that's composed of low-cost index funds like those available from Vanguard, then you're going to end up with actually a very sophisticated investment program that is incredibly easy to implement and maintain.
Okay, that's great. And one other thing is, a lot of people who are young these days have significant student loans. Would you give different student loan advice to someone with a chronic medical condition? Obviously, these could be dischargeable in bankruptcy if someone does become, excuse me, not bankruptcy, but in the event of permanent disability.
Yeah, they're certainly not dischargeable in bankruptcy. That's one of the weird things about student loans, but that's the way they work. The federal student loan system is fairly generous if you get permanently disabled. Your student loans basically go away as far as federal loans. With a private loan, you've got to be a little bit more careful. Some of them go away, some don't, some just try to work with you, etc. And so you've got to read the fine print. And that would be really important, for example, if you're considering refinancing away from a federal student loan into a private student loan to get a lower interest rate. You might be giving up some of those disability protections. If you think there's a very high chance you're going to get disabled and your federal student loans are going to be forgiven because of that, well, you might want to pay the minimum on them rather than trying to pay them off quickly. But that's pretty depressing, I think, to carry student loans throughout your entire career. So I'd still, if I could, I'd still try to pay off my student loans just to not have them hanging over my head.
Okay. And the last thing is, I know you kind of got into this industry because you felt some financial advisors were ripping you off. What are the major scams or mistakes to avoid?
Oh, I think there's lots of scams out there. The main thing to avoid, I think, is products designed to be sold, not bought. And that happens when you run into somebody that calls themselves a financial advisor, but in reality is an insurance agent or a mutual fund salesperson masquerading as an advisor. You're not actually paying them for their advice. You're paying them a commission on some product they're selling you. And so I think that's a big pitfall that a lot of people get into, and they end up with, investment products or insurance products that really aren't the best thing for them. Just happens to be what that person was selling. So I think that's a big mistake. Another big mistake, of course, is just living hand to mouth. And so many Americans do, doctors included. A lot of people are surprised to learn that doctors, despite a high income, are often living hand to mouth, even on $200,000 or $300,000 of income. So if they can live hand to mouth, certainly people on a more normal American household income can do so. But you've got to figure out how to live on less if you want to be able to carve anything out for the future.
Yeah, I know that's true. I personally knew a general surgeon who had to work essentially until he became permanently disabled at age 80 because he hadn't saved anything. So, moving on to the last category, let's say someone works for a long period of time, but maybe they can't make it to age 65 or 67. Perhaps they become disabled in their 50s or early 60s. What should they know about?
Well, I mean, we all get disabled at some point, right? Almost nobody can work until the day they die, unless they die in a car accident on the way to work. And so we all have to plan for our own disability. And hopefully that's comes after we become financially independent. If you've managed to save up enough money and you become disabled enough that you can't work at 58, but you've already saved enough for retirement, great. You're fine. You retire. You don't have any sort of a financial hardship caused from the disability. People who are disabled in their early to mid 60s often will look at their Social Security retirement benefit as the primary source of their income, because you can claim that at age 62. Now, obviously, if you ask a financial advisor, what should most people do? Should they wait until 70 or take their benefit at 62 or 67, or when should they take it? And most advisors will say, as long as you're in good health, you should try to put it off until 70. But that requires two things. One is being in good health. And if you're getting disabled early in life, you might not be in that good of health. You might not be expecting to live the typical, life expectancy, in which case, maybe it is better for you to take your Social Security benefit earlier. Number two, you got to have enough money that you can get to age 70 without the Social Security. And a lot of people just don't have enough savings to do that. And so they end up having to take their Social Security at 62 or 65 or right when they stop working or whatever it is. So that's kind of the way to think about that Social Security benefit. Now, as far as your nest egg, whatever this amount you've been saving up, hopefully, a typical withdrawal rate you can take on that is about 4% a year. And you can adjust that upward with inflation each year. And if you do that, it's likely to last at least 30 years without running out of money. There's no guarantees, obviously, from investments. If you want guarantees, buy some sort of an immediate income annuity. But most people are okay just keeping an eye on their portfolio size and withdrawing a certain amount each year. Now, the worse your health, the lower your life expectancy, the more of that you can take out. And it might be if you're 65 or 70 and only expecting to live another 5 or 10 years, you can take out quite a bit more than 4% a year. But you also want to be careful not to completely run out of money.
Yeah, one thing I'll add is I believe if you become disabled between age 62 and 67, there may be a benefit for filing for SSDI. Even if you could just claim Social Security, you may get a slightly higher benefit. The other thing is, let's say you have some assets. Is there a strategy to which accounts to draw from if you're retiring early?
Well, keep in mind, you may be wanting some of those, government or welfare benefits. And so you got to look at what do they look at. If you need Medicaid at age 63, they might look at one asset differently than another asset. So you've got to be a little bit careful about that. But as a general rule, what people should be doing in retirement is they should be withdrawing and spending from any taxable money they have, meaning money that's not in a Roth IRA or in a 401k. It's just in a regular brokerage account. And that's the money to spend first because it's not protected from your creditors. It's it gets taxed as it grows. And that's generally the money you spend first. You try to spend the high basis assets first, meaning the stuff that you bought most recently or that hasn't appreciated as much. Because if you sell something, let's say you sell some shares of stock that are worth $100,000 and you paid $80,000 for them, well, you've only got to pay taxes on the $20,000 worth of gains, but you still have access to that whole $100,000 of value that you sold. And so, as general, people spend their high basis assets first before spending low basis assets. After the taxable money is gone, then generally people withdraw from retirement accounts, and that might be tax deferred, meaning you got to pay taxes on them as you withdraw, or tax free. meaning a Roth type account where you don't pay taxes on money you take out. And typically, the best approach is to use some mix of those so that you can kind of set your tax rate where you want to pay it during those retirement years. And so a blend of those two types of accounts that you withdraw from is generally the right move to make. If you've saved up a health savings account, that can also be used for any health related expense, including the payment of Medicare premiums. And if you're dealing with a serious disability, you probably got plenty of healthcare expenses that you can spend that HSA on. After age 65, you can spend that money on anything you want without any penalties, but you do have to pay taxes on it. So you're better off spending on healthcare expenses so you don't have to pay any taxes on it either.
You have thoughts on long-term care insurance. Is that worthwhile or generally not worth it?
There's kind of a donut hole where long-term care insurance makes sense. If you don't have that much in assets, your plan should probably be to spend down those assets until you qualify for Medicaid to pay for your nursing home. If you are not married, for instance, right? If you're going in a nursing home long term, you're probably not coming out. And so that's okay if you spend down your assets and then Medicaid pays for the nursing home after that. But if you're married, that can leave your spouse impoverished. And so that would lead you to think a little bit more about getting a long-term care insurance policy in place. At a certain amount of wealth, you can self-insure this risk. Call up the local nursing home in your area that you'd want to be in, find the nicest one if you want, find out how much it costs a year. And what you'll probably find is most of them cost something like $50,000 to $100,000 per year. Now, if you want 24/7 live-in, skilled help in your house, it's going to cost you more than that. But you can get a pretty nice nursing home, even in a relatively high cost of living area for something around $100,000 a year. And if you think that even a relatively long stay in a nursing home is about 5 years, well, if you've got $500,000 in your nest egg that you can dedicate toward that sort of an expense, then you can self-insure this risk. So I find people that are multimillionaires, 2 million, 3 million, 4 million plus, often choose to just self-insure against long-term care costs rather than buying long-term care insurance. But if you're in that area in the middle of this donut hole, where spending down to nothing would be really bad, especially for the remaining spouse, and you don't have enough to really self-insure this cost, then it's probably worth buying long-term care insurance. It's not great insurance, though. You should be aware of that. It's had lots of problems over the years. Lots of those companies went bankrupt about the time people needed them. And so they're still kind of working out the kinks in the long-term care insurance system. I'd love to have people be able to self-insure that risk, but I recognize that not everybody can, and you just have to do the best you can with the available products out there.
All right. Well, that was a lot of information, very helpful. Any final words on financial advice in general?
I think let's go back to the beginning where I talked about the importance of a plan. Just sitting down, putting this stuff on paper, not ignoring it, but making a plan can really go a long way. When you write it down, it does a few things for you. Number one, you can go back and review it later and remember why you decided what you decided. But number two, it helps show you where the gaps in your plan are and where the gaps in your knowledge are. So I think it's really helpful to write down a financial plan.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Dahle. I'll include some links to his blog. If you have a question, if you search on it, the answer is probably there, and a link to his books as well. Take care, Jim.
Thank you very much.